Today's stuff going to be learning is Bava, Batra, Daf Zayin. Reminding everyone about the Masala Rosh Hashanah. If you want to take the 10-day challenge of learning the 10 dapim from Masechet Rosh Hashanah, having to do directly with the holiday, you're invited to join our efforts, and you're invited to share it around. So you can find all the details on our website. We're going to get started now with our daf. So we had a whole discussion. Remember, we were talking about selling boats. Let's just remind us where we're up to, because finally, at the end of today, we're going to get back to the very end of the Mishna that we started. We're talking about selling a boat. We had a whole discussion in the beginning. What's included in the sale? What's not included in the sale? Well, the first thing that we're going to need to do is to work out terms. What does this mean? What does that mean? Then we got off on a whole long tangent of all our stories about people who went on boats and learned all sorts of interesting things. And from there, we talked about all sorts of other sugyot, about haughtiness. Then we got back to our topic, but we didn't really go directly back to the Mishnah. We went to this big machloket about how to acquire a boat. And then, right, Mashicha or Masira, and then we had this discussion about how to acquire the boat, although then we talked about that perhaps, right, it depended where you are. We had a whole back and forth about it. From there, we got off on a tangent about OTO, because once they were talking about boats, they also mentioned OTO. OTO is how to acquire a promissory note. So with the promissory note, we had a big debate between Rebbe and the rabbis. Rebbe said you acquire a promissory note with Masira, passing the promissory note on to someone else. So if you owe me money and I want to sell that obligation, that instead of me collecting, someone else will collect it, I can just hand them the document. And that's enough. The rabbi said that is not enough. I need a shtar saying I'm giving the rights to someone else. And then we just ended with Rav Papa saying it's not even enough to say I'm selling you the shtar, because selling you the shtar could be, we ended the Gemara with that, could be just to cover my flask as a piece of paper. I actually have to say I'm selling you the shtar and all the shiabudim that come along with it, meaning all the liens on it, anything that this shtar can be used to collect, it's all going to you instead of me. And that's the only way I can sell a shtar, according to the rabbis, is to write up a new document and then give the person that document. Okay. Now, in other words, I also give you the promissory note, but I also give you this document that documents exactly what it is that's going on here. And then we ended with this, and I read the Rashbam and I got confused for a minute, but you'll see why I got confused. With the Rashbam, basically, right now, there's a huge difference in value between the value of a shtar chov and the value, I mean, obviously, depending on how much the promissory note was worth, and the value of covering your flask with it, using it like aluminum foil. So the Rashbam points out, which is a little hard to understand how we could say this, because then this would be in any case, but if we assume that you're doing it, let's say, right, just to cover your little flask. So if I basically sold you my thing for, let's say, $90, like we said yesterday, and a piece of aluminum foil costs $2, then basically, if we're going to say that's all you really acquire, well, then you could claim bitul mekach and get your money back. So I guess there's logic to that. It's saying you don't get the promissory note, but you at least will get your money back, and we'll do back the exchange, and we'll cancel the whole thing, because otherwise you spent $90 on something that's worth $2. So that doesn't make much sense. Okay, $2 probably even putting a high price on one little piece of aluminum foil. Okay, now back to our topic. So it's clear, and this is really very obvious, that Rav Papa, who basically says if you want to sell a shtar chov, a promissory note to your friend, you have to write down, not only do you need a shtar, you also need to write down it's coming with all the obligations that this shtar comes with, and that means he holds like the rabbis. Well, Amar Ameimar, top of our daf, Hilchata otiot niknot b'misira kerebi. Ameimar says, at least according to the version that appears in our text, okay, we'll see this, two totally different versions of this Gemara. Ameimar says the halacha is otiot niknot b'misira like Rebbe. All you have to do is pass over that promissory note, and it's obvious what's going on. And the friend who you passed it over to, right, when you sold it to them, you sold them the rights to this. You don't need to write a new shtar documenting all this. Not necessary at all. Why not? Well, we'll see in a minute. So Amarle Rav Ashi. Now, first of all, it's a little bit strange, and perhaps this is why Rav Ashi is going to ask this question. When Rebbe disagrees, which is Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, with the rabbis, generally we hold by the majority opinion. So Amarle Rav Ashi la Ameimar. Gemara or Svara. Now, Gemara doesn't mean what we use to say Gemara. Gemara means a tradition. Did you get this as a tradition? Was it passed down to you that there's a tradition about the fact that we hold like Rebbe in this area? Which makes sense according to this reading because Rebbe is a minority opinion. And then at least if you have a tradition, then I get it. O Svara. Or is it just that logic, or not just, or it's one or the other, right? One could argue tradition is stronger. One could argue logic is stronger. It depends on, I guess, your bent. Or was it logic? Is it just because you thought he has a more logical position? So I'm a Gemara. He says, no, it's because I have a tradition. So that's what Ameimar explains. I hold like Rebbe and I have a tradition about it. But I'm a Rav Ashi, Svara Namihu. So Rav Ashi says, by the way, it's also logical. Forget about which is better, but you actually have both going for you. You have a tradition, and I'll explain to you the logic behind the position and why it's a stronger position. And here comes the line, Otiyot mile ninhu. Otiyot, meaning a promissory note, is just words alone. What does it mean it's just words alone? Well, it's just words written on a piece of paper, right? It's not, there's no inherent value in a promissory note. The promissory note isn't worth something. It's not like a cow that's worth something or a jug that has value, inherent value. We talk about this all the time. Shtar doesn't have any inherent value. It's just symbolic of value. And because it says something in there, it means something, just like a check. It means, I'm giving this money, but it's just because I wrote it down. It's just words. And mile b'mile lo makanyan. You can't acquire words with words. Meaning, okay, so good question what it means. The way the Rashbam understands this is that you need an action. In other words, you need to hand over the promissory note. It doesn't, and not that you don't, it just doesn't help at all to have a document because you don't need this document that says, I'm giving you the rights and everything that goes along with this promissory note to collect, because that's just words. And words aren't acquired with words. And therefore, it's totally unnecessary. All you need is an action. What's the action? I pass the promissory note on to somebody else. What is that? That's the strongest thing you could do. You don't, the writing another document about a document is just words on words. That's not so significant. And I want to just read it in the words of the Rashbam a little bit, because now we're going to then see the opposite version. But you can already see, if you read just the Rashbam, you can already see there's an issue here, because the Rashbam starts with the words, if you look at the very top of our daf, Hachi Garsinan. This is the way it should be read, which means that not everybody holds this way. You have to learn, when you read text, to be keyed into key things, to certain words. If somebody says, this is how it should be read, it means that other people don't think so. And then you'll see how he even further tries to prove his reading, because it says, Amar Ameimar, that's his version. He holds like Rabbi. And this seems pretty clear from the Gemara. And the conclusion in many other sugyot is otiot niknot b'mesira. And therefore, that must be what Ameimar is saying, because it matches with other sugyot. And then, again, when he gets to mile ninhu, he basically has to explain it according to his version, which is why I'm now going to use this to prove that otiot are niknot b'mesira only, and you don't need a shtar. And that's because, right, he said, ma'aseh biyadayim, I'm skipping down a bunch of lines, dahainu misira hu ikar kniyatan. Now, it's a little bit tricky, this reading, because it's not saying you can't acquire words with words, it's saying you don't need to, right? It's a little bit tricky, because what he's saying is, misira is enough, you don't need anything more than that. Instead of saying it doesn't work, like a shtar wouldn't work, you already have the misira, you wouldn't. He's just saying it's unnecessary. And then he says you need a maaseh biyadayim, and what's that? You need action. What's the action? Misira, right? And that's ikar kniyatan. That's the main way of doing it. But shtar acher lo mahane. But another document is not going to do anything. It's useless, because mile b'mile no nikne, which he understands as, and this is important. See, this is the way he reads it. Shtar lo yikne b'shtar. You can't acquire a document with a document, because this is words and that's words, and you can't acquire words with words. You need something stronger. What's the idea here? Words themselves are not so strong because they don't have inherent value. So in order to acquire them, you need something stronger. Words themselves are not strong enough to acquire things that aren't strong. So you're going to need something stronger than that, and that's the action of Masira. Now, what's difficult is the rabbis also think you need Masira. They just think you need to add the shtar. And he points out, his reading is, it's just pointless. You don't need it. It's unnecessary. But if you look at Tosfot, it's a short daf, so we have some time to read inside. Ameimar, Hilchata Otiot Niknop Masira. It's not, it's right. The first Tosfot on the daf is a continuation from the previous daf. So it's a little bit further down in the daf. Tosfot's on the outer side. Katav Rabbi Yehuda Gaon de'ein otiot niknot b'chalipin. Okay, let's leave the chalipin aside right now. Ula Rabbeinu tamu l'ri near Ed Garsina ein otiot niknot b'mesira k'Rabbanan. Seems that they have the opposite girsa that Ameimar said we can't acquire a otiot, a shtar, right, a promissory note with mesira only. You need a shtar like the rabbis, and then Ameimar paskins the opposite. And then he says, dehachi hilchata, because that's the halacha. Okay, as opposed to the Rashbam who tried to prove the halacha is the opposite, and that would support my reading. He says, no, the halacha is the other way, and therefore it supports my reading. So obviously there was a bit of a debate about what the actual halacha was. Nowadays, or as time went on, the majority of the opinions actually hold by the other girsa. And that's why I thought it was important to bring in. I don't like to confuse you too much, but this is a totally different version, and we're going to have to read the rest of it according to this version also, which is, this actually is holding like the rabbis. And that's in fact the way the Shulchan Aruch paskins, like the rabbis, not like the way the Rashbam reads it. Even though the Rashbam said, oh, there's a lot of places in the Torah that say Otiot Niknot B'Mesira, and the Tosfot says the exact opposite, but we all paskin the other way, so that must prove this other version. Now, how do we read the Svara of Rav Ashi then? Because specifically, you are going to acquire words with words of a shtar. So here, they don't have the opposite girsa. They don't say mile b'mile miknian, right? You can acquire words with words. He's just going to have to explain what is the words with words that don't get acquired. So with the way that Tosfot's going to explain, we're not going to read this whole thing inside, but the way Tosfot, the Ramban, and others explain is transferring a document is just mere words, right? Because if I give you a promissory note, it could be I'm giving you a piece of paper. It could be I'm giving you the rights to collect it, right? It's my words alone that basically I say, I'm giving you the rights to collect this loan. That's really making it happen. And therefore, it's not enough for me to just give you the promissory note, because it's just my words that go with it is what's important. And that's right. That's not how do I acquire those words? You need to have it in writing. In other words, it's the opposite of what we said before. You need words in writing specifically. So mile b'mile means the mile they're talking about that doesn't work is my words alone to give you this promissory note. And as the promissory note itself is words, and my words are, I'm giving you the rights to this when I give it to you. But that's not enough. It's not enough to just pass you a promissory note with my words alone that just say, I'm giving you the rights. You need to write down a document that documents it all, that's making it clear what I'm doing here. And the document, according to the second version, is actually what gives it the strength. So it's complete opposite interpretations. So now, however we interpret this, obviously what they're trying to say is, okay, now we're not going to need to divide it into this opinion or that opinion. Okay, so again, two ways, completely opposite ways of reading it. Ameimar holds like Rebbe, or Ameimar holds like the rabbis. But the point is that to acquire words, right, mile b'mile lo miknian, you can't acquire words with words, meaning it's more difficult, right? You have to do something much stronger, whether it's an action of Masira or whether it's writing down something in a document. So on this issue, this line, mile b'mile lo miknian, which again is not Ameimar, just remember the structure. It's Rav Ashi who brought support to Ameimar from a logical argument. It's a question on that. And it's going to take us a little while to get to the question, because we're going to have somebody says and someone builds on what the first person said. And it's what the last part that's going to be relevant. So patience. Vilo, is this not the case? V'hama Rabba bar Yitzchak Amarav. Rabba bar Yitzchak said in the name of Rav, again, this isn't connected yet. Shnei shtarot. There's two ways you could give a shtar. Okay, there's many ways. This is a small thing they're talking about. If I want to sell you a field, now we're not talking about what we were talking about before, a promissory note. I want to sell you a field. And I do it through a messenger. And I say to the messenger the following thing. And now we're going to have three options of how I can do this. So right now there's two, and then someone's going to add a third, and that's going to be the relevant for our purposes. Zichu b'sadeh zo leploni, v'kitvu lo et hashtar. If I say, let's do a kinyan right now, like a handkerchief, okay? We call it kinyan sudar, a symbolic acquiring, act of acquiring. I give you, let's say I said I'm selling you the field, so I give it to a messenger, and I say to the messenger, pick up this handkerchief, and with it, you acquire the right to the field for maybe I'll go back to names, okay? Let's go back to Ruth and Naomi. It's a little easier. Ruth wants to give Naomi a field. So Ruth says to Yael, I'm giving you rights to the field right now. Pick up the handkerchief for Naomi, and you'll acquire the field on Naomi's behalf. Now, this is something we've learned many times. It's called Zachin La'adam Shelo B'fanav. Naomi's not here, but it's good for Naomi to have a field. It's only in her best interest. So therefore, this middle person, Yael, is allowed, as soon as she picks up the handkerchief, the field is basically Naomi's. She acquired it on behalf of Naomi. But in this case, Ruth said two things to Yael. So with this handkerchief lifting, you're going to acquire the field on behalf of Naomi. Now write a document and give it to her saying that I've sold the property to Naomi. Now, if Yael, so at that moment, Ruth basically has passed over the field to Naomi. But the shtar wasn't written yet. Okay, so let's say 10 minutes later, before the shtar is written, or it could be 3 days later, or whatever it is, if Yael hasn't yet written the shtar and given it, even if she wrote it and didn't give it yet, if Ruth decides she doesn't want to give a document to Naomi documenting this whole thing, she can change her mind because nothing's happened yet. The only thing that happened was the kinyan. Now the kinyan is valid. So this field is Naomi's. She just she's not going to necessarily get the shtar. Okay, that's case one. If when Ruth did the handkerchief transaction with Yael on behalf of Naomi, she said the words, I'm giving you, acquire this field, for Naomi, on the condition that you write her a shtar. Now, in this case, the kinyan doesn't go into effect immediately because the kinyan is done with a stipulation, which means until the stipulation happens, the kinyan is not effective, which means that choser bein b'shtar bein b'sadeh. If Ruth wants to change her mind about the whole thing, nothing's been done yet. Because yes, it's true, Yael picked up a handkerchief to acquire the land for Naomi, but that whole kinyan acquiring was only atznai. It's like we saw people could give a get upon condition. The get's not going to be valid even if the woman has it in her hand until the condition is fulfilled. So it's the same kind of idea. Rav Chia bar, and so that's not yet related to our point. Rav Chia bar Avin amar Rav Huna. Chia bar Avin added in the name of Rav Huna shlosha shtarotim. There's actually three. You missed this last possibility. Trey hadamaran, the first two, like you said. Idach, the third one is like this. Im kadam mocher v'katav tashtar. If Ruth decided before any money transpired, before there was any kinyan, any acquiring, act of acquiring, Ruth decided to just write the shtar that she's selling the house or the field to Naomi. Okay, so kadam mocher v'katav tashtar. Now, it seems that it's possible they talked about a sale, okay, but it's possible they didn't talk about a sale. It's possible Naomi doesn't even exist in the world yet, and Ruth was just so eager to sell her property that she already wrote, I'm selling my property to, maybe left it blank, or maybe filled in the name of the person she was planning to sell it to, but there's been no arrangement yet. What Ruth was doing, and we've seen this case before, Ruth is preparing because it's not so easy to find a sofer always, and she's desperate to get rid of her property. She needs the money. So she's getting everything ready so that or maybe Naomi lives far away until she sees her, she wants everything in hand, and she writes up the document as if they've agreed on everything and as if it's a done deal. What happens in this case? Okay, so first of all, we have a parenthetical statement turning now to Amud Bet. Ke'otasha shaninu, by the way, you might say this is a little strange. How can Ruth write a document? Isn't this a bit of a false document? There's no arrangement yet. Naomi didn't agree to the sale yet. So maybe she didn't agree to the price. It's a bit of a false document. And what's the problem with false documents? Or, a document that, it's not a false document, but hasn't yet happened. Let's say it was a loan. If Ruth wrote a document that says, I loaned Naomi $100, well, what if, it's written, She gets witnesses to sign. They haven't even done the loan yet. Well, Ruth could go claim, pay me the money. It's dangerous, right? Okay. So in this case, it's really not so dangerous to have this shtar written. Why? It's dangerous for who? For Ruth. In other words, the only problem could be in the future is if this document gets lost, right? Ruth wrote, I sold Naomi the land. She hasn't sold it to her yet. The document gets lost. Naomi finds it, says, oh, great. I just found a document that says I own this property. And she'll go to court and prove that she owns the land. And Ruth will have nothing to say. So, but Ruth can do this if she wants to, because it's only to her detriment. It's not to anyone else's. So if she wants to do something that might potentially hurt her in the future, but she's doing it because it's better for her because she wants to have the document so she could quickly make a sale. So that's what we're just pointing out, that this is a possibility this would happen, because luckily she could do this, even though you might think maybe it's a little bit weird. Why is she writing a document without the other person agreeing to it? And again, looks a little like a false document because the sale hasn't happened. Ke'otasha shaninu, as we learned, and this we learned already, kotvin shtar lemocher af al pi she'en lokeach ibo. You can write a shtar for the seller, even if the buyer is not in the picture and not yet have agreed to the whole thing. Okay, that's just the parenthetical statement. Now, what's the law? So if Ruth writes the document first, okay, so again, it says in the Gemara here, Adam mocher v'katav et shtar. They haven't yet done the kinyan. Now, how can you acquire land? So Ruth basically, by writing this document, has expressed her willingness to sell the field to Naomi. So if Naomi after that goes and does a chazaka in the land, starts plowing the field that they were talking about, not only does Naomi acquire the land, remember we distinguished in the first case between Naomi might have acquired the land, but she doesn't get the shtar, because remember, Ruth changed her mind about the shtar and the shtar hadn't been written yet, but she already had gotten the land. In this case, not only does Naomi acquire the land, because Ruth obviously showed a willingness to give it to her, and Ruth did a chazaka on it, showing, Naomi did a chazaka saying, I'm now here, this is my land. Now, if the shtar is in Ruth's possession still, the shtar now is owned by Naomi, wherever it is, even though what's missing here? There was no misirat hashtar, remember? She never passed the shtar on to Naomi. But wherever the shtar is, could be anywhere, it could be in Ruth's possession, it could be in the Sofer's possession, doesn't matter. As soon as Naomi acquires the land by doing an act of acquiring, the document automatically becomes hers, wherever it is. Now, what does this show? This shows, now, where did we see Ruth's willingness to sell this property? Besides, she wrote a shtar, right? But it's basically, she told Naomi, I'd like to sell you my land. She never gave her the shtar, right? So what do you see here? You see here that words, which is the shtar, right, is acquired with words alone, because Ruth told, there was no misira, there was no action. Okay, if we go by the Rashbam, right, you need an action. There was no action on the behalf. Ruth never gave the shtar over to Naomi. So how else did she acquire this document? So you see, it's actually kind of easy to pass over words, because this shtar went so easily that just by Ruth saying, I'd like to sell you this land, and Naomi doing this act of chazaka, it was immediately acquired. Okay, but the chazaka theoretically, okay, we'll get to it in a minute, how we're going to answer this, and you might remember how this whole thing works, and it's a whole different system, a mechanism, you could say, but that's not important just yet. Okay, now, how do we know that this is effective? So again, it's true that it was the act of chazaka that did it, but that had nothing to do with the shtar. The shtar itself was really acquired, it seems like, just by Ruth saying, I'll give you the field, and then the shtar existed, and Naomi did some action, and with that, the shtar gets to her. Seems like pretty easy way, mile b'mile mikne. And the Gemara explains, how do we know that this is the case? That mikne shtar b'kol makom shu, v'zo sheshaninu, and you'll probably remember this line. It's a Mishna in Kiddushin, and we've seen it a whole bunch of times. Nechasim she'en lehem achrayut, niknim im nechasim sheyesh lehem achrayut b'kesef b'shtar b'chazaka. Okay, we've talked about this, like if I buy a house and I'm acquiring the furniture in the house, or maybe even you're promising to give me more furniture that's not even in the house. As soon as I do it, act of acquiring of the house, all the furniture is mine, whether it's in the house, whether it's out of the house, whether it's somewhere else. I acquire all the movables through that. This is what we call a kinyan agav. That's why you might remember this is called the kinyan agav, where through acquiring land, even though metaltalin you can acquire with chazaka, with shtar, with kesef. Metaltalin you have to actually do an action. But if you're doing one with the other, you can acquire the movables through the land, okay, through the acquiring of the land. How you do this right now doesn't interest the Gemara. What interests the Gemara right now in the question is, you see how easy it is to acquire the shtar, because the shtar doesn't even have to be in Naomi's hands. It could be in Ruth's property. It could be on the street. It could be anywhere. Doesn't matter where it is. It gets acquired because Ruth agreed to sell it over, and because Naomi did some act of acquiring, but she didn't acquire the shtar. So it looks like mile b'mile kanya. To which the Gemara says, what are you talking about? Agav shane. No. This is a mechanism, a unique mechanism that overrides other types of things. In other words, theoretically, mile b'mile lo mikniye. Okay, like Rav Ashi said, you can't acquire words with words. Can't acquire, you need either, again, like the Rashbam, let's just go with the Rashbam now for simplicity's sake, you need an action like Masira, the shtar has to be handed over. In this case, the reason why the shtar gets given, is acquired by Naomi, has to do with this other mechanism called the kinyan agav, which is a very strong way of acquiring things. How do we know it's such a strong way? Well, we'll show you a good story about it. Okay, it's a story they love to tell. We've seen it many times. Ki de Rav Papa, havale tracer alfe zuze bechozai. He had 12,000 zuzim that he had loaned to someone, and the person is now in bechozai, which is very far away. Now, the problem is that the person who borrows money assumes responsibility until the money gets back to the person who owns it, right? Until then, if Rav Papa were to send a messenger, Rav Papa couldn't travel to bechozai, it was too far. If he sent a messenger, the person who owed the money would never send it with the messenger, because what if something happened on the way? He would lose 12,000 zuzim, which was a crazy amount of money, and he'd have to pay it again. So he wasn't willing to give any messenger the money. So Rav Papa had no good way of getting this money back. And it was the days before there was Federal Express and things like that. So Akninu Niale, Rav Papa finally said, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to give Rav Shmuel Bar Acha the rights to the money. Meaning, right, what would have helped Rav Papa? If Rav Papa could go there himself and pick up the money personally. But Rav Papa couldn't do that. So he basically sent someone else who was going to pick up, because as soon as Rav Papa gets the money, like the borrower is fine, no more responsibility. So what he did was he created a situation where the messenger would be the one who owned the money, basically, and would assume the responsibility. And Rav Papa probably promised him, look, if something happens, I'll reimburse you. Okay. But technically, as soon as the borrower gives the money to Rav Shmuel Bar Acha, then the borrower would be free of any responsibility, because Rav Shmuel, it was as if he gave the money to Rav Papa. It's just he gave the money to the owner of the money. Now, who's the owner of the money? Well, Rav Papa transferred ownership rights of the money to Rav Shmuel. Now, how could he do that? First of all, mile b'mile lo kanye, you need something strong, right? So what did he do? It wouldn't have been enough to just write a shtar or something like that, because the money's far away. You have to pass the money if you want to give money to someone and give them rights. So how did he do it? Agav asifa debate. He said, I'm giving you, he took the little area, the threshold in front of his house. He said, I'm giving you rights to this right now. Let's do a kinyan on it. And with that, he acquired all this money. Okay. And then that worked. So what do you see? This is how strong a kinyan agav is. Okay. And I actually think I skipped a line. I'm very sorry. I skipped a line. Let me just go back for a minute. The way they prove this whole thing, I forgot, this is the main, not the main point, but it's the beginning to this. I skipped a line. The whole way of proving this, okay, it's not so bad I didn't read it. I'm reading it now, because now comes the key line, which is, in general, money is very hard to acquire, much harder than other things. Why is that? It goes back to the same thing about the shtar. Money doesn't have inherent value. Money's value, even if the metal has some value, the amount each coin is worth is not necessarily dependent on the actual value of the metal in it. It's a symbolic value that the community decided this coin is worth this coin is worth that, this coin is worth that. So, especially if you're talking about paper money. But basically, What they're saying is a matbea, and we learned this in Perek HaZahav, which is a complicated chapter, is not nikne b'chalipin. Because money is only symbolic, it's more difficult to acquire it. And you can't acquire it with chalipin. There's actually a debate about this. Okay, this is your rules that you can't. Chalipin is when you do a barter, and also it could mean a symbolic, like picking up a handkerchief. You can't acquire money in that way. Okay, there's a bunch of reasons given why this is. I'll give you two basic reasons. So one is what I just said, that money doesn't have inherent value. It's only symbolic value. Another is Rav Hai says, which I thought was very interesting. Money is not an object, and this might be a little different today. People trade commodities, but money isn't something that you buy. Money is something you use for purchasing other things. So even if you do buy it, you're only buying it because of its purchase power, not because of its use of using the object itself. So these are all different ways to say why money is different. Coins are different. In any case, with the Gemara, basically what the argument here is, how are we going to prove that agav is a very strong kinyan? And because money can't be acquired by chalipin, but can be acquired through agav. And that shows how strong kinyan agav is, and that's the reason why that whole thing we talked about, the hirzik bekarka nikna shtar b'kol makom shehu, that the shtar becomes acquired wherever it is. It has to do with agav and has nothing to do with words being acquired with words. Okay, because it all has to do with kinyan agav. And this story with Rav Papa highlights that, because here's a case where money that can't be acquired by chalipin was acquired by agav. And that proves the point that agav is clearly a very strong type of kinyan. And therefore, again, this has nothing to do with our topic. And the end of that story is that when the guy came, Ki'ata, when Shmuel came with the money, this really worked, Rav Papa was so excited. Nafik la'ape ad tavach, there's different interpretations what this is, but basically he ran out to greet him. Perhaps he went all the way to the city of Tavach to say, oh, wow, I'm so excited you're here. It's so exciting that you brought me my money because I thought I would never see it again. And this shows, it was a good solution for him to have done it in this manner. Okay, I see you're asking, does he get the threshold back? I'm sure they made an arrangement that he acquired it and then, was going to give it back probably. But he did acquire it definitely for that moment in order to acquire the money. Also, the money, obviously, he gave back. He wasn't giving him the money to keep. That was clear. So while he acquired the money for the, I don't think it was symbolic. I think it was, you acquired it right now. You'll give it back to me. Okay. Just like the money. The money was Rosh Shmuel's for that period of time. It's a bit of a risk on Rav Papa's part because Rosh Shmuel could have said, oh, the money's mine. So it doesn't really talk about, did they make some arrangement to protect Rav Papa down the road, but I guess he trusted him that he was going to do this for him. Okay. Now, as I told you at the beginning of class, now we're just getting back to the Mishna, and there's one more term they need to explain. You would have thought two, but apparently one was pretty clear to them. These are the parts that aren't sold when you sell a boat, the slaves that work on the boat, the martzufim, which apparently was obvious to the Gemara what that was, which less obvious to us, but it means the bags where they put the objects, the cargo of the ship. Below it antiki, and not the antiki, which is really the cargo or whatever objects that they're shipping. My antiki, but the Gemara isn't familiar with that term. Amarav Papa iska de begava. It's the esek, it's the objects that are in the boat. Okay, it's the cargo. New Mishna. Machar takaron lo machar tapradot. Now we're moving into wagons and animals and things they used animals for. They used animals to pull wagons. They used animals to plow. So that's really what we're discussing now. If you sell a wagon, it doesn't include lamacharta pradot. It doesn't include the mules. Okay, the mules that pull the wagon. The Rambam has a different interpretation of pradot, even though a pered is a mule. He says it's from nifradot, which is something that's separate. And what he says is that we're talking, and this is a Rambam in the Perush HaMishnah, the Rambam has a whole commentary on the Mishnah. He says it's the poles that they use to pull the wagon. And because they're a little bit separate, they're called pradot, from nifradot, which is separate. And because of that, they're not included in the sale because it's like an external piece that goes with the wagon that's considered its own separate piece. So whether you say it's the mules or whether you say it's the poles, I actually think that the Gemara that we're going to get to in the beginning seems to work a little bit better with the Rambam's interpretation, but one could explain it also as mules. Macharta pradot la macharta kalam. Okay, so If you sell the mules, it doesn't go with the wagon. Okay, the wagon doesn't mean it includes the mules doesn't include the wagons. It sounds like, no batteries included, right? You buy a toy, it doesn't include the batteries. Okay, you buy the batteries, right? It doesn't include the toy that's next to it that needs to go with it. These are all considered separate. Macharat tzemed lo macharat bakal. Macharat bakar lo macharat tzemed. Now the tzemed was the yoke that they would put on to keep two animals together so that they would plow together. So if you sell the animals or you sell the yoke, it doesn't include the animals. If you sell the animals, it doesn't include the yoke. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Hadamim Modi'in. Rabbi Yehuda says, it depends what price you paid. And this is what we talked about before. We ended yesterday's stuff with this and started with it today about what if it's, you spent $90 on a $2 piece of aluminum foil, that would be ridiculous. So Rabbi Yehuda says it all depends on how much money you spend. Kate Sad, how does this work? The Mishna asks. If you say, please sell me your yoke for 200 zuz, everybody knows the yoke is not 200 zuz. Obviously, when you said yoke, you meant yoke with the animals. That's Rabbi Yehuda's position. Chachamim, kind of surprisingly, omrim ein hadamim ra'ayah. We can't use the price as any sort of proof. Now, this seems strange. Why not? Should be pretty obvious, right? And also, why didn't we mention this in earlier sugyo, right? It seems like it would be a very relevant factor. In fact, we didn't get into some of the commentaries did bring up this issue a little bit here and there. Perhaps also because we hold like the rabbis who don't think that money is a factor, the price a factor. How do you view this then? So what was the 200 zuz? So we'll see later in the Gemara and tomorrow's stuff, they're going to suggest perhaps it's a gift. That, the person's poor, you want to give them a gift, they're not going to take a gift. So you say, I'll buy this for a lot of money. Perhaps that's it. Perhaps, perhaps maybe you could say it's ona'ah. That's how we're going to end our daf with the question. If you spend $200 on something that's worth $50, you should be able to cancel the whole sale. Okay. And maybe you can actually. Okay. Because the question, the Mishna is not, can you cancel the sale? The question in the Mishna is, can you claim that the animals are yours as the buyer? That might be no, you can't, but you can at least get your money back. Right. And imagine the scene. I spent $200 on what I thought was a tzemed and the animals, right? The yoke and the animals. You come and claim, no, I just meant the yoke. And then I say, I want the animals. And you say, go prove it. And I have no way to prove it. And again, what do we always say? Burden of proof is on me. But since I spent so much money, I can at least get my money back. I won't get the animals, but I'll get my money back. And I'll say, fine, then I'm canceling the deal because that's not what I wanted. And then I could get my money back. So that's a possible way to understand the rabbis. We'll see this in the Gemara later. We're actually going to end with a question today about it. That's really where the Gemara is going to end. What about Bitul Mekach? Shouldn't you be able to cancel it? So the Gemara starts off first with the first part of the Mishna, and then we'll get right away to the Tzemed and the Bakar, which is kind of the more interesting case. Tani Rav Farber Ma'arava Kamei de Rabbi Abau. So Rav Farber brings bright in front of Rabbi Abau. It was very typical of Emoraim. There were people who kind of memorized the bright Torah and would bring them to the Beit Midrash. So this Rav Farber brings it in front of Rabbi Abau, and he says the following. The Breita says, Machar et hakaron, machar et hapradot. If you sell the wagon, it includes the mules. Okay, different from our Mishnah. So Rabbi Abau says, V'ha'anan lo machartnan. But doesn't our Mishnah say, no, it doesn't include the mules? To which, or the poles, however you interpret that, to which Amrle, the student, Rav Tachlifa, says to Rabbi Abau, Ismiye, so should I erase it? Okay, erase it doesn't mean erase it because it wasn't written, but should I erase it from my repertoire of Brightot that I recite? Should I get rid of it? Is it a wrong Brighta? Amrle lo. Okay, if they could avoid it, they preferred to avoid wiping out Brightot. There must have been some way to explain it. To targum anitach ba'adukimbo. You can explain the Mishnah if a case where you sold me a wagon and the mules were tied onto the wagon, then it's included, okay? Or if they were poles, this is why I think the Rama makes even more sense. If the poles were attached to the wagon, tied on, then they would be included, okay? Either which way you interpret it. Now we're going to get back to Machar Tetzemed Lo Machar Tabakar, and we've seen this sugya before, by the way. Hechidami, what exactly is the case? If everybody where we live calls a yoke, and animals, the cattle, and nobody includes ever in the word yoke also the animals, well, then it's obvious that he only sold the yoke. And therefore, Bakar lo zavinle, and didn't sell the animals. And there's no debate. The rabbis and Rabbi Yehuda don't disagree in a case like that. Elu dekarile nami lebakar tzimda kule zavinle. And if everybody calls a yoke is used as a term, right? This is just a good indicator of words meant different things in different times or different cities, right? People use them, words, it's very depending on time, depending on where you live. There's all different dialects, all different ways of using words. So if you live in a place where the word semet includes animals, the animals that go in the yoke, then the oxen, obviously it includes the oxen. There's no debate here. So everybody agrees. So what's the debate then? So we're basically going to narrow the debate to a very unique case. It's a place where they call it tzemed, a bakar, right? Cattle, or oxen, yoke. But ikanamu dekari lebakar tzimda. But there are some people. There's a big debate here whether it's majority versus minority, whether it doesn't matter majority, minority. And there's differences, very important differences between the two versions. But let's just go with our reading, which is there's some people who do this, there's some people who do that. And therefore, what's the problem? Well, we don't know what the arrangement was, right? We don't know. This is like the kad and the chavit. Remember, you say, I'm buying a chavit, and they provide you with a kad. You say, well, in our town, people call kad, they use those interchangeably. So I don't have to give you more than a kad, the seller says. And the seller has the upper hand because the person who now, right, the seller is the one who has the money. So if you want to get something bigger, better from the seller, the burden of proof is on you. So Rabbi Yehuda savar hadamim modi'in. Rabbi Yehuda says, well, we go by the price, and then it'll be a good indicator. And Rabbanit savar eina damim ra'aya because of hamotzi mechaver alav haraya. Money is not proof enough. What I spent is not a good enough proof of what was intended. And therefore, I can't claim that I get the oxen as well. And that's really the debate. Rabbi Yehuda said, what do you mean? It's a very clear proof. 200 zuz is not a yoke. It's obvious that it includes the animals. And Rabbanan say, no, the seller could say, oh, well, when I say yoke, I really only mean yoke. I don't mean animals. And that's what I meant. And that's what I said. And we're going to, you want to prove otherwise that we had, and this is why, right? Get everything in writing, get everything explicitly said. You should have been more careful as a buyer to have everything explicitly said. So we'll understand this, as I said, better tomorrow. Like, well, then why'd you spend all this money on a yoke? It's a little bit strange. And the first question the Gemara asked is what I said we're going to end with was, Im ena d'Ameimar ayah have a bitul mekach. Well, at least if you can't prove it the money, but at least you should be able to get your money back because this is more, right, assuming you pay more than a sixth more, which probably you did because a tzemed is worth a lot less than the oxen that go with it. So you should at least be able to cancel your transaction. So, and they seem to think that the rabbis don't think that because otherwise they would have said so in the Mishna. So we're going to get back to this and try to figure out tomorrow, is there bitul mekach, is there not? Maybe the rabbis don't hold by bitul mekach, maybe not in this case for some reason. We'll deal with that all and finish that up in the beginning of tomorrow's daf. So what did we do today? We started with Ameimar about how does he rule? And unfortunately, it was a little confusing because we saw two totally opposite readings of the Gemara, two totally different texts. Once, I mean, it's not totally different. All you need to do is you need to change two words, actually. Instead of otiot nikel mesira, you need to have a word there, add the word ein, and instead of kirebi, ki chachamim. Okay, so you'd have to change two words, and there's two totally different versions, and which would also affect the halacha. And then Rav Ashi brought a logical proof, even though Ameimar had said I have a tradition. Rav Ashi brought a logical proof, and then the Gemara tried to reject that, and that took us a little while to understand those three types of shtarot. And the third one seemed to indicate that milei, right, could be acquired by milei, but Gemara rejected that and said no. The reason why that star was acquired there had to do with a totally different reason, because it was kinyan agav, which is very strong. Because look, coins that can't get acquired by chalipin are acquired by agav. That shows how strong the kinyan it is. And if it wasn't a kinyan agav, then we could really say it wouldn't have been able to be acquired by words alone. We finished up with the Mishnah translating what is antiki, and then we moved to the next Mishnah about what happens when you have a wagon and an animal and a yoke and an animal. what is acquired with what, right? And really all things sold separately according to the Mishnah, other than Rabbi Yehuda, who said we're going to take it based on the price of what you paid for the item, and the rabbis disagreed on that. And then we just narrowed what exactly is the case that they disagree about. And with that, we'll finish for today and meet up tomorrow, reminding everyone about the Masala Rosh Hashanah if you want to sign up or get others to join.